Boa tarde. Gostaria de dar as boas-vindas aos nossos alunos, nossos professores e a toda a comunidade que está participando desse evento. Em especial, um agradecimento ao nosso palestrante dessa tarde, o professor Giulio Verdini, da University of Westminster de Londres. Professor Giulio, thank you very much for accepting the invitation to be with us here today. A aula magna, ou aula inaugural, é a abertura oficial das atividades do segundo semestre de 2024 no PPGA, mestrado e doutorado em administração da Universidade de Caxias do Sul. O tema que será abordado hoje vai ser desafios e oportunidades sobre sustentabilidade em espaços urbanos, e sem dúvida é de grande relevância no contexto atual em que a gente vive. Aproveito para convidar a todos para participarem no mês de outubro da 24ª Mostra de Iniciação Científica, pós-graduação, pesquisa e extensão, que acontecerá concomitantemente com o primeiro Congresso Brasileiro de Gestão e Inovação, que terá como tema inovação, gestão e empreendedorismo em cenários desafiadores. Finalizo assim minha breve fala inicial e aproveito e já chamo a professora Ana Cristina Fachinelli, mediadora desse evento, para que faça a apresentação do professor Giulio e inicie na sequência a palestra. Bom evento a todos.
Obrigada, professor Alex. Boa tarde a todos. Vou começar em português para dizer àqueles que nos seguem que esse evento é um evento muito importante, porque é uma das primeiras ações concretas, né, que a gente desenvolve após a assinatura do nosso acordo com a Universidade de Westminster, que aconteceu em fevereiro desse ano, e que prevê uma série de colaborações, inclusive mobilidade acadêmica entre os nossos alunos da graduação, da pós-graduação. Então, a gente está muito feliz de estar começando com essa aula magna com o professor Giulio. Então, agora vamos em inglês, né? So, welcome to all of you joining us online. We are really pleased to have Professor Giulio with us today for our session on Sustainable Urban Futures, Challenges and Opportunities in Emerging Economies. Professor Giulio is a PhD in Urban and Regional Development and a reader at the School of Architecture and Cities at the University of Westminster. He currently leads the master's course in International Planning and Sustainable Development, and also serves as a visiting professor at the Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in Morocco. Thank you so much, Professor Giulio, for taking the time to share your insights with us. The topic of sustainable urban development is particularly important for our program in administration, where innovation is a key area of focus. We think that understanding how to build sustainable urban futures is essential for driving innovative solutions that can address the unique challenge faced by emerging economies. Thank you again for being here, and we are eager to hear your talk. Thank you, Giulio.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Professor Alex and Professor Anna Cristina. I had the pleasure to meet actually in London a few months ago when there was a visit, and then basically we started a discussion on how to sign this agreement. And I'm really glad that this is materializing now with this first lecture online, but I hope it's the first of a series of initiatives, event, research project that we can jointly do together. And I'm going to share my screen. Let me see if I can do it rapidly. Yeah, let's see. Can you see the screen now? Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So I'm very honored to be here to talk about this topic that for me is very close to me for a number of reasons. I've been, let's say, in my research experience in the last 10 to 15 years, I've been especially working in the context of China, so which was, let's say, considered one of the most interesting cases of an emerging country that has moved rapidly from being a middle-income country to be a sort of more advanced country, sort of competing with the most industrialized countries of the world. I lived and I spent a few years of my life in China, 6 years, and then I remain attached to that. And then recently I sort of moved more to teach in North Africa, and I've been expanding my network also in other countries. And so I like to draw this parallel between what has happened in Asia, in China, and what is happening today in Africa. But before that, let me just say that for my PhD, when I did my studies, and I think I started 20 years ago, more or less, to do my. Then I finished in 2007. Actually, I got a scholarship to come to study in South America. So in reality, my first interest in countries undergoing a fast urbanization was actually in South America. But I have to say that then, life is unexpected sometimes, and then I moved to other areas of the world to explore these topics. Now, back to but I mean, I hope that at the end of my presentation there will be scope for a discussion and some questions maybe on whether some of the learning from China and today from Africa can be interesting for South America, especially because I think that there's many experiences that you have implemented in I'm thinking about Brazil, your country, and obviously I'm thinking about the old sustainability urban development that took place in Curitiba, just to make an example, is certainly of a great interest for what's happening today in Africa. Now, the occasion for this talk is really something I was asked to write a piece from the RIBA, which is the Royal Institute of British Architects, this year, and it was published online, this piece on the future of emerging economies from the point of view of the economics of the built environment, as a series of what they call horizon scans. So horizon scan basically is an exercise of trying to look into the future, so the next 10, 20 years, trying to look into trends, historic trends, and signs of potential change to envision what could be potential pathways for development in the next decades. And it's been a quite innovative experience that has been promoted by RIBA, and the topics were very diverse. It was on the climate change emergency, on the migration and social challenges, on technological innovation. And me, with other colleagues, we wrote pieces on the economic development. And the question that I was asking is how planners, or architects, so those who are in charge of designing cities, planning cities, can contribute to sustainable urban futures in fast changing context, particularly focused on, as I said earlier, China, Asia, and Africa. Now, to start with, I would like to make two caveats that when you do this kind of exercise of looking into the future, we need to acknowledge what is the current situation today. Now, the current situation today, I would argue, is a situation of global complexity and high level of uncertainty. And this is due to the combination of multiple crises that we have seen in recent years materializing all together. It's socioeconomic, so the social gap is environmental, climatic crisis that merge together with institutional urban crises in a way that are becoming, as and I quote here, casually entangled in ways that significantly degrade humanity's prospects. Cases of multiple crises materializing, let's say, all together, and of course, I don't even touch the whole problem of climate emergency that, and I mean, as you have experienced, dramatically flooding in a few months ago. An example of urban polycrisis is, for instance, a city like Beirut that for many years went through a number of conflicts that has really weakened the institutions and the institutional arrangement of the city, the way in which the city has been managed and operating, until actually, suddenly a big explosion of on the port, due partially to this institutional weaknesses, has implied huge destruction in the built environment, something really unprecedented probably in the history. So on one hand, we have this situation of high level of uncertainties that things can change over the night. And then the second caveat is that we are also at the end of a cycle in the history that we can call it the end of the illusions. And the illusions were that actually globalization, as we have tried to see after, let's say, the collapse of Soviet Union with the so-called the end of the history, the globalization would have been beneficial for everyone, and instead it was not. So countries actually should have reinforced their interdependency in the globalization with the new multilateralism, common understanding, integration of economies together, bringing to potentially modernization, opening up of market opportunities, and also democratization of processes. All of this has been highly problematic in recent years. We have seen how, for instance, the social crisis that is affecting even the West somehow so badly has implied a turn into far-right movements and so on, and the political parties. So all of this is actually is against forces of globalization, as we have seen in the last 3 decades. Now, what is happening in cities, and this is, I think, is a good example of what I'm talking about, is that all these, countries that have been somehow in a process of deep transformation, and Egypt is a case of this kind. There was a democratic revolution in the early 2010s and in 2011, and then all of that actually failed. The state went back to authoritarian rules, and suddenly actually we realize, and I think there's a citation from a sociologist, an Egyptian sociologist, about the urbanization in Egypt, is that what has happened is that city has grown somehow, but without actually bringing much benefit to people, to local democratic processes, to the formation, to wider diversity of cities, to sustainable processes. And so he calls, for instance, he talks about urbanization without urbanism, which is about these sort of big sprawling cities which are just responding to certain specific needs and not to the wider needs of the society. So what are the trade-offs actually for a built environment that is facing multiple crises? This is the point that I would like to make, and I suppose you, as a business school and with the sort of economic thinking in your mind, you always talk about and discuss about trade-off. Now, what we have to give it away in order to achieve something else. Now, let's now step back and look about the future, as this was the exercise that I was asked to respond to. If we look into the world demographic growth, we have seen that in 2022, just 2 years ago, the world has surpassed 8 billion inhabitants. Now, more than this, more than 2 billion, meaning a quarter of this total, has been added almost entirely in emerging economies, which means that those are the countries that are actually already where actually most of the urbanization is taking place. 1.1 million in Asia, 0.7 in Africa. In the next 25 years, it is expected that additional 1.6 billion will be added, again, 90% in emerging countries, this time mostly in Africa, 0.9 billion, and 0.6 in Asia. This means that in the past, Asia was leading demographic growth. So of the past 25 years, particularly China was the machine for growth. Now Africa is expected to take over for the next 25 years. Now, let's look at how China managed. Of course, I will be brief. I can't spend too much on that, but just briefly on how China, or better, could manage to become the engine of growth of Asia. Now, certainly the state had a key role in steering growth by opening up to market economy. That was Deng Xiaoping who started that in 1978, actually, at that time, opening up with market-oriented mechanism for industrial development, particularly in certain areas. But on the other hand, given the fact that, of course, the state was and is still so strong in controlling the factors of production, retaining a high level of strict control on domestic mass migration, the so-called quota of people that could migrate from one city to another one, is the UCO system, and also controlling the large-scale land development processes. A case like this, Shenzhen, would not have been possible without, let's say, the designation from Beijing of a special economic zone that would attract channeling migration to move from the countryside towards the city, with, of course, very well managed by the state, by the central level of control, and then attracting foreign investment with, of course, fiscal incentives and so on. And this was the Shenzhen miracle, like in 3 decades from 30,000 people to over 10 million people. Today, we know that the economy of China is slowing down. And on the other hand, and this is a Washington Post newspaper, the very kind of clear title, Africa's Rising Cities. So there is increasingly discussion whether the next miracle will be the African one. And so the question is that I want to pose for, that I pose for this horizon scan is then, can Africa replicate the Asian trajectory, and can it manage its massive urbanization effectively in a way as China did? Now, to respond to this question, obviously, we would need quite a large set of data, but just to briefly say, Africa is a complex continent, and by the way, it's also hard to talk about such a diversity with just saying Africa, because North Africa is very different from Sub-Saharan Africa. The level of urbanization is very different, for instance. But certainly some of the problems that cities are facing are related to, for instance, this sort of sprawling cities, which are, in a way, the consequence of a specific land tenure, which is, for certain reason, coming from the sort of indigenous knowledge system and traditional knowledge, which is clashing with the urbanization forces, and not necessarily actually meaning that these agglomeration forces are creating efficient cities. I mean, this is a case of Nairobi, where there is a scattered urbanization, which we know very well in planning, urban planning. It's highly unsustainable for the way in which sewage, water system, infrastructure are organized. And then another problem that is obviously, and something that obviously in Latin America you have seen and observed in decades before, is this urbanization of poverty. So that the large concentration of people migrating into cities tend to gather in areas where poverty persists, and it's very difficult then to change this destiny of some part of the city. Now, back to China, in 2014, so 10 years ago exactly, the World Bank wrote a report that you can see here towards efficient, inclusive, and sustainable urbanization. And for the first time, the World Bank acknowledged and praised China for having implemented in the previous decades a highly socially considerate urban development model. This is what they have said. And this model was, let's say, well, the indicator that they used to do that is that they lifted out of poverty a large chunk of the population in the process of urbanization. That was done with major investment in infrastructures, in retaining control, as I said, sorry, in the floating population, people moving from countryside to cities, in some cases without acknowledging the same rights to the city to those people, so lowering the cost of labor to the extent that urbanization would have been highly profitable to a certain extent. And here we can see investment in infrastructure. Suddenly, after, especially China started to invest in infrastructure after the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the stimulus package that China released was able to construct the most extensive high-speed rail network in the world at a cost that was a third lower than those in other countries. Again, putting together sort of efficiency in planning, again, high level of central control, and so on. On the other hand, sorry, I'm back to the previous slides, this model that has been very sort of targeting towards infrastructure development and helping people with their own economic development has come with a high environmental and health cost, and also additional risk that we would see later. There's a number of what I call hidden cost of the China model that we need to consider if we want to then really argue to what extent this model can be suitable today for Africa, and whether actually we can afford to have such a model of development, given that the condition globally, the conditions have changed so much. Some of the works here are books. For instance, the China industrialization model has meant to have a huge impact on nature. And one of the costs of urbanization, for instance, along the Yangtze River Delta, the Yangtze River, the big river that crossed China from the inner China to Wuhan to Shanghai, there was actually the extinction due to pollution of the white dolphin. And I remember a few years ago, we heard this lecture from Samuel Turvey from the London Zoological Institute that he did actually hold the last, to say, field trip to the Yangtze River Delta to trying to see whether the white dolphin was still there, and they couldn't find it anymore as it was extinct. Another is the fact that it is scattered industrialization, especially in the first phase of development, has meant a high level of scattered pollution in many parts of the country. And for instance, there was at some point in 2017 this book on cancer villages living with pollution in rural China, on the fact that actually there was a real big issue of food security due to this. So you can somehow solve the social problems, I mean, in terms of material resources, but on the other hand, you can create other social issues, for instance, health and so on. Myself, my little contribution 10 years ago, I wrote a paper on the cost of urban growth at the fringe of a Chinese cities, where I was basically assessing that relocation process for most of the people living in the suburban areas of large metropolis would mean the loss of a number of skills and knowledge embedded into people and their own cultural resources, because once they are relocated into the city, they lose they lost at the time their connection with the land, their connection with their livelihood, and they become basically urban dwellers, just relying on rent from housing, because they could get some housing as a compensation, but of course losing all their own knowledge and cultural resources. So that's another cost. Not to mention the cost that we learned from COVID, that still the society is highly controlled by an authoritarian state. So in a situation where COVID will broke and appear, the state could actually enforce very strict rules that on one hand they could allow China to go back to normal very quickly, but on the other hand, the cost on people, on well-being, on mental health of people, especially in cities like Shanghai, was extremely high. Now let's make a parallel about again. So, and these are is an example of trade-off that I'm trying to make about, yes, what are the benefits of China, but also what are the costs. Again, if we see the next years and the prediction of the global construction sector by 2030, it's obvious that there's a bouncing back from what has happened with COVID. So the sector is predicted to reach 13.5% of global GDP. So it's a huge chunk of the global wealth that will be only in construction. And almost 60% of this growth will be in emerging markets only. So meaning that, as we have seen the figure, it will be still a bit in China, but of course, China has reached its peak somehow, still in Southeast Asia, but largely in Africa. On the other hand, 13.5% of global GDP, 21% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's clear that this will come at a high sort of environmental cost if we don't sort of decarbonize the process of construction. On one hand, is about decarbonizing the construction process. On the other hand, there's a huge challenges ahead in cities, not just in Africa and not just in Asia, but certainly this is the big challenge of Europe, is about retrofitting obsolete housing stock. This is a case study, an image of central Casablanca, where with the extreme heating condition, now people are relying increasingly on air conditioning if they can afford. On the other hand, at the opposite spectrum of this, in Madagascar, in Antananarivo, you have a situation where there's large majority of people living in informal settlements that are really showing low resiliency to drastic climate conditions. So again, you've seen how to deal with this in terms of housing stock, the new one that is going to be added, that is going to create more environmental problems, and all the persisting problems in terms of retrofitting the existing and making safe the informal one. One of the questions that was asked, of course, by specific question that was asked by Riba was that how our architects and planners, are they fit for purpose? Do we have the skills? Do we have the competencies to face these big challenges, or even just to understand and to frame this trade-off? Or do we need to do something more, as I argue? Now, just before COVID, there was a report, an international report, which has been quite popular for a while, jointly done by the Commonwealth Association of Architects and Planners and Surveyors, about planning for climate change and rapid urbanization, meaning that there is an awareness that who is going to deal with urbanization in the next decade will be not only to add, let's say, something to the existing, but also to consider all the potential cost that this will add on the society and on the environment. On one hand, the survey is very revealing because it shows that there is a shortage of architects and planners, by the way, and I just focus on planners for now. So countries obviously like, UK and somehow also Australia and Canada, they have quite a high number of town planners, but also architects per capita on the total amount of population. While on the opposite, countries, those are the Commonwealth countries, from Malaysia to Nigeria to Pakistan, Tanzania, Sri Lanka, there's a huge shortage of people, graduates actually, that they would need to deal with this massive process of urbanization. So interesting, the urbanization is taking place where there is shortage of skills. But more than that is that there's challenges that the profession will need to face that are no longer something that is not generally taught in schools and universities. So is not only a problem of quantity of architects and planners, but also quality and what they've been taught in class. 100 years ago, actually more than that, within the Royal Institute of British Architects, there was a conference, very famous, in the town planning conference, where actually the final statement of the conference was that it was no longer adequate to regard the town planning as the prerogative of the architects. Town planning was something more. So more than 100 years ago, within RIBA, there was a decision that there should be some people focus really on planning cities. Today, I think we are at the night, it's another cycle of history where there is still the need to do something more. What this something more means, it's still unclear. I'm sure that part of the response would be for, how to say, expanding our capability in terms of interdisciplinarity, or in terms of just transdisciplinarity, sort of incorporating knowledge from different fields and so on. I mean, myself, when I did my studies in architecture and planning, then I was persuaded to do my PhD in urban and regional development because, I mean, it would have been beneficial, despite the fact that not many would believe actually at that time that an interdisciplinary formation would be good actually for doing academic career. That was what I was heard, what I was said at the time. But anyway, back to the point, today we need to experiment new forms of new methodologies for knowledge production that can help to tackle this massive urbanization. And this is part now of my, so I go a little bit beyond my horizon scan, looking into my practice, if I might say that, my research practice. I am involved in a number of research projects internationally, and then this is part of the let's say the link that we have at Westminster between what we experiment in practice, in our research, in our experience in the field, and then what we bring it back to the class. Partially, these experiences are shared with the master in international planning and sustainable development that was mentioned before by Anna Cristina. So on one hand, you can find here on the left-hand side is an experience of co-production about water management, resources and problems, and water scarcity due to climate change in a very sort of fragile rural settlements in rural Morocco. So it's an oasis in near the border with Algeria. And I did a couple of years ago, as I said, a co-design workshop with local stakeholders, association of people, to find and to discuss together what could be a potential sustainable future for your city, for your town. So meaning that sustainability is something that is embedded into a place. It's not something that we can teach what that means, because it is something that is somehow depending on the local resources, on the aspiration of development, and on a clear assessment of what realistically can be done in a very complex social, institutional, economic context. And part of the response, there is a book actually, if you want, I mean, it's online, it can be downloaded, open source. Part of the response to that was about readdressing some of the models of development, recipes for development from sort of more tourist-oriented towards more oriented to upskill people for agricultural production, more resilient to climate change, and also restoring with the traditional techniques, water system, and all of that. But I don't go too much into the details. On the very opposite of this is another, how to say, experience that I do. This is funded by the Prime Minister Office of Bahrain, and it's also supported by the King's Foundation in the UK. So I'm invited to animate a capacity building workshop on envisioning the future of Bahrain for the next 25 years. And it's the second edition that I do, and there will be another one next May. And this is a matter of bringing together people working in different sectors. There's normally between 15 to 20, let's say, students, but these students are already employees of different ministries in Bahrain, trying to think about what are the bottlenecks of development, where we can head in the future. Last May, we had a very interesting discussion in Bahrain about the fact that, for instance, a place like Bahrain, which is, by the way, this is, I mean, it would be wrong to call it an emerging economy because it's has emerged already, but it's just to show the methodology used. So part of the discussion was to, for instance, invest in education, higher education, to move the economy from an oil-based economy towards a more advanced economy, which is a typical problem which are facing most of the middle-income countries that we are dealing with. Another one, among the other sets of skills and tools that architects need to and planners need to understand, is that we don't necessarily need to plan the city by looking into these very sort of futuristic, smart cities and artificial intelligence driven, because we tend to use these words, but sometimes actually what actually that means, it could also mean that we simply introduce element of innovation within historic context where there's already some of the responses, for instance, to the big emergencies of today, like climate, for instance, is already embedded into the way in which we used to design and to plan cities in the past. So this is a work that I've been involved in with Cities Alliance on assessing how to reuse, let's say, traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge for building cities that can be still valuable today. And just going back to the case of Cairo that I mentioned at the very beginning, that picture that I show is part of the new development on the outskirts of Cairo that it's called Smart City, but in reality is simply a very sort of high level middle class suburban sprawling city with some level of surveillance, of course, and using some smart devices to make it more efficient. But we need to be very careful about this. Now, what a sustainable city should look like, going to the kind of solutions and trying to see signs of change in the past that can we use for the future. Now, there is this World Cities Report, 2022 UN Habitat, envisaging the future of cities, which is also based on a sort of foresight exercise, and increasingly foresight is used within UN trying to envision what sustainable cities could be. And this report is really advocating for a model of cities that are sustainable, and that means being collaborative, meaning all actors coming together to solve complex and real problems on the ground, well coordinated with effective multilateral intervention. And the multilateral means also the multi-scalar intervention, so from neighborhood to city to region, because we can't deal problems of cities without considering that, I mean, you go from the sort of well-being of people that is taking place at the level of the street, of the square, of the public realm of the city, but then ultimately, as cities are growing so fast and somehow merging and overlapping together, there is still the need of metropolitan governance and coordination that can actually help to put all these pieces together. The report is stating that by 2030 it's unlikely that the objective of reducing the number of people living in inadequate housing will be reached, because that was the goal of the Sustainable Development Goals, to eradicate informal settlements. So, and obviously with all the crises that we've been through, the pandemic first and the current climate crisis, but also the conflict that are emerging in large part of countries that are emerging somehow, or the Middle East, or Central Asia and so on, very unlikely this goal will be met by 2030. Now, lesson from the history. I said earlier that China, on one hand, and probably this is already to sort of start thinking about some conclusion of this talk, the model of China might not be replicated as it was, but also there are some learnings from China that we need to consider. Just before COVID, actually, there was a number of micro level innovation that was taking place at the local level, both in terms of enabling collaborative approaches for instance, micro regeneration of cities. This is a community group in Shanghai, but also smart devices used for enabling collaboration. And I found that extremely fascinating. I mean, this is a smart use of the smart city, let's put it this way, when it can help to connect people to, for instance, self-manage public realm, public space, and so on. There's a number of experiences in rural areas of bringing together again people in collaboration that for a country like China has been certainly not how to say so frequent in the past. From the environmental point of view, China has been really leading on the sponge city approach. China is, I mean, from the point of view of the weather, it's obviously flooding is one of the biggest problem of the whole continent to a certain extent. And the sponge city approach was very successful, and that was due to a reforming in the municipal financing system and the system of incentives of cities, so that, I mean, within the political party, you could achieve political gains if you could actually renaturing some part of the city, achieving sustainable goals. So there was a very big shift in the governance to enable this nature-based solution in sponge city, so that land can be more permeable to rain and heavy intense rain. And finally, this is another quite very interesting and fascinating things that happen in China. For a middle income country, there is a tendency to associate what is urban and industrialized, what is rural is backward, is poverty, is non-modern, and is there will be a sort of progress and linear process of moving people from countryside to the city in the process of development. In 2018, China issued one of the most ambitious national policy for the rural revitalization in the countryside. At that time, I did an evaluation document for UNESCO on assessing the impact of this policy in Sichuan, on a region, from the point of view of, let's say, protecting rural heritage, traditional knowledge system, traditional local production. Here you can see, for instance, bamboo production, which is something that comes from the past, but can be highly innovative and linked to the future. And this is, for me, one of the few examples, really, in the world of a middle-income country that has so much invested in this. Obviously, China is ambitious to be a global player and to support Africa in this process of urbanization, also to support with the loans and funding. So the question is whether this can be, how to say, another area to look at. Certainly, we know that as of today, China has invested 2.5 times more in African infrastructure development than all Western countries combined together. So it's a huge contribution that China is giving to the development of Africa. Somehow, you might argue, with all the skills that was learned in managing the urbanization process in China, this can be used for Africa. And obviously, this association is not so easy to make, is instead very controversial, because the question is how this money is used, where actually this investment goes, and what are the conditions and the deal that African countries can have with China on repaying and so on. And so basically, who is losing and who is winning. This is a picture of in Madagascar, where there was this highway. It's probably the only road that is paved and in Madagascar, that was built by Chinese to connect one mining center to the port, and where basically there was no usage apart from trucks going to mining, to carry the materials, the raw materials for being shipped to China, in a form of new colonialism somehow. And then the locals would use that just for their own traditional rural activities. So that's not the way in which China investment can benefit Africa. On the other hand, and I suggest to read this paper from the conversation from a colleague that now, she's a colleague of mine. She's from Uganda, but now based in Hong Kong. So she's writing quite a lot recently on Asian Africa. So arguing that the problem is not only China, but also the problem is that there is mismanagement of funding when they comes to Africa, so that many countries, they are not using these potential resources effectively. How to avoid the middle income trap? So talking about infrastructure, it's clear that urban infrastructures will be one of the solutions. So infrastructure can be, as we have seen before, can be probably not, I mean, less useful, let's put it this way, for the growth and the future of a country, but other infrastructure can instead be, can make cities more efficient, and this is a case of tramway in Casablanca. So there are, I can quote other cases in the metro system in Algiers that was built by Chinese, by the way, or other countries which are really going through this pathway very rapidly. Urban innovation, this is where, well, I cite that because it's the university where I'm visiting professor, and when I was invited in 2019, I was, to a certain extent, so fascinating and so surprised to see that for decision of the state, the king, and then with the resources of a mining company, state-owned mining company, suddenly between Marrakesh and Casablanca, they have decided to construct a new green, they call it green city, with one of the sort of largest now today intellectual powerhouse of North Africa, the University of Mohammed VI, with all departments, lots of connection between industry and territory and the research centers, which is growing very rapidly and is creating a precedent for, let's say, developing this kind of ventures in the context of Africa. And then not to forget that Africa is also, and again, I'm sorry for generalizing here, a place where there's a lot of innovation that goes beyond the big structure of the economy and the massive infrastructure that we have sort of discussed before, but it has to do with the ways in which new urban commons have been shaped, new circular economies at the local level have been introduced, renaturing cities, local democratic processes at the very local level. Here you can see a book edited by Rocco and Silvestro on insurgent planning practice. So just to say that it has to be seen, let's say, all together as a big laboratory of experimentation where certainly things will be different from what has happened for China somehow. So the future of the built environment professional will be in a complex world, and the kind of to go to the conclusion. Allow me just the last a few minutes, and then if we have, if you want to have, I mean, to ask some question or just to make some comments on how maybe the let's say this picture can resemble what you have seen in your own context in Brazil or in South America. Anyway. Generally speaking, those who are dealing with cities, with ideas about innovation, sustainability, they borrow, let's say, they borrow information, they borrow urban models from one place to another one. So actually, we operate de facto in a very interdependent world. I mean, it's economic, but it's also a matter of borrowing ideas. I mean, just to make an example, we discuss the 15-minute cities in Paris a few years ago, and suddenly everyone is discussing about that, you know. The point is that in some cases, these ideas have materialized in some places by, let's say, producing what I call extractive urban and architectural outcomes. And probably Dubai is an example of that. So it's a large concentration of resources, but on the other hand, is also to a certain extent not a model of sustainability that can be easily used for or easily suggest for African countries. On one hand, I've argued that there's a way to rediscover, there's a need to rediscover the everyday life of cities as well. So not only, let's say, how to create the next Dubai, but also how to preserve the knowledge, the culture, the specificity of place, the cultural aspect of each place. And then finally, all of this would also imply a new mature and equal partnership between global North and South, and trying to, let's say, on one hand, break some of the usual connections, let's say, that have been also quite unhealthy for how we use ideas from countries to another, or whether they've been imposed during the colonization processes and so on, and how we can create, as I said, more equal partnership. So all of this, I think, is the challenge ahead that is something that we need to bring in our courses, in our discussion with among colleagues and students. And again, what role Latin America can play in this very complex scenario that I've tried to depict. So we need to reimagine probably new models, and hopefully part of the work that we'll be doing together with the University of Caxias do Sul will be about reimagining some of these models for the future. Just a picture of the university where I teach in Morocco. And here you can find reference to the piece that is available online, The Economics of the Built Environment. And thanks for the attention. And I'll stop sharing here.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Giulio. Thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. We have some questions here, so I will do that while we have time. So, from Professor Fábio Verruc, how can Africa achieve a sustainable level of urbanization, considering that it's a very diversified continent with several regional differences and disputes?
Yeah. Do you want, sorry, to ask all the question, or shall I go one by one?
Yes, okay.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
So I have one more from Vinicius. Congratulations, Professor Giulio. Good points. I have a question. How do researchers play a role in this context of cities? And how can they put what they are studying into practices? And I have a question also. I think it would be the last one. While you talked about the little town of Morocco, about local characteristics in the search for solutions, I was thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals. What do you think about SDGs? And there is the possibilities for place-based solutions. I mean, beyond the importance of the SDGs as a global pact for a sustainable future, how can we implement these goals, the SDGs directives, when local realities may have singularities or urgencies that are very, very local? Would there be a potential for innovation here? This is my three questions. Let me see if there is another. No, these three questions.
Okay, thanks, Ana Cristina. So, I mean, the first question obviously is very complex. I think about the big diversity of Africa. I think I've said that I feel also myself a bit uncomfortable in talking about urbanization in Africa, because, for instance, North African countries have reached a level of urbanization that sometimes is actually quite close to what Latin America has reached or Europe has reached, while Sub-Saharan Africa is really growing very fast. So most of the urbanization will be probably mostly in Nigeria and a few other countries, let's say, along in east and west part of Africa. So first we need to see where urbanization is going to happen, so where there's demographic growth, and depending on that, there will be completely different challenges. And then obviously there's still problems of conflict, instability, institutional weaknesses, which is part of the discussion that I was making about the loans from China. So the problem was, I mean, because many have criticized China for borrowing money they call it the diplomacy trap of the debt diplomacy trap. And also that they would lend money and just to make this country become dependent. But on the other hand, we have seen now that China, with the economic slowdown, they have reduced quite a lot to lend money to Africa because they cannot afford anymore. So it was a genuine way to reallocate actually the surplus of resources that they had. But the problem is that those resources have been not used properly in some cases. So for instance, the cost of some infrastructure, there are some articles in the paper that I show in, I don't know, Uganda, Kenya, it's way higher than in China. So one starts to question, is the local institution that would make a huge difference in the way urbanization can be managed. So the first question is about really the diversity of problems. On the second question, what's the role of research, how to put that into practice? I would say that on one hand, we need evidence, and we need evidence sometimes for Africa, it's very complicated. And it's about availability of data, is very complex issues. And I remember a story about a researcher from, very important researcher from Switzerland, that he would use, very low cost, for instance, GPS track attached to people bicycling to just understand the patterns of mobility in a city in Kigali. So you need to be that's innovation for me, how you can come up with this solution which is low cost and can give you data. Yeah. And that's very fascinating. So how it's anyway, we are used to deal with scarce resources. No, it's probably the situation where that's in that sense, Africa can be a laboratory of innovation. On the other hand, and myself, because I like doing research, and that's probably what I brought. It's more in the governance, in collaboration, how to bring stakeholders together. And I found also very enriching when I see the demand for that. And I'm sure this is growing. So there is a growing demand for wider sort of collaboration in all processes. So this is two ways in which we can reach an impact. And then on the very big question of Anna Cristina, so to end up on the SDGs, I share the same frustration, because at SDGs they are telling us that we need to achieve environmental outcomes, social outcomes, governance. It's a dreamland that is not always applicable in the reality. And we've seen that with the 2 years, 1 year and a half of COVID, all the target has been completely, screwed, so that we cannot achieve anymore erasing poverty, leveraging people from poverty. We cannot ensure affordable housing for people, because priority actually are others. And that requires innovation and place-based solutions. So it requires to use the way in which we operate locally to change these indicators, because with these wider global indicators, we will not achieve any sustainability. And that goes back to what I was saying at some point, that sustainability, it's a discussion that takes place locally. What is possible to do in a context? Obviously, the problem of climate now implies that we need to achieve also certain targets. So we need to kind of operate within certain constraints, but I think this will be the market to determine somehow those constraints. And we need to operate within that to make sure that we really rediscuss what can be done, the indicators, which might not be applicable for everyone. So possibly we will see Africa that will urbanize in a very, very different way from, and we cannot expect to have China, or certainly to have Europe or South America. So that's to come to the conclusion, I think.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Very rich content, Giulio. Thank you very much for that. And
thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you for your time and for your generosity in sharing your knowledge and your experience with us. It makes me even more happy to have this possibility to follow collaborating with you, with the university, with your research group. Thank you very much. And obrigada a todos que nos acompanharam até aqui. Eu vou pedir para o professor Alex fazer as palavras de fechamento dessa aula magna. Obrigada.
Muito bem, Ana. Então, em nome do programa de pós-graduação em administração, gostaria de agradecer a todos pela participação. Muito obrigado, professora Ana, pelo auxílio aí na moderação, né? Fazer o meio de campo aí com a palestra. E o professor Júlio, né? Obrigado por compartilhar suas ideias conosco. Professor Júlio, thanks a lot for sharing your ideas with us. Thank you.
Thank
E
you
assim,
very much.
ok. E assim encerramos a nossa aula magna, desejando um excelente semestre a todos. Boa tarde a todos. Bye.